again, folks, this is where we really get to dig into some of the details and go into a lot of different things, looking at what's happening sort of around the nation and how we're thinking of these things differently in a lot of different communities. And I'm very excited. I'm joined here by a really great panel. So first of all, I'm going to start with the Regional Administrator for the United States Department of Housing and the Housing and Urban Department, and that's Candace Valenzuela. We're very excited to have her here down from Fort Worth, so thank you for joining us. We're also joined by Scott Turner, who is currently the owner of Riverside Homes, and until today when I went and looked at his bio, apparently you can catch him on HGTV, which I did not know, so learn something new every day about your friends. We're joined by Dr. Jake Wegmann, who is currently an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And last, but certainly not least, we're joined by Mike Kingsella, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Up for Growth. And I'll give them all an opportunity to talk a little bit more about their work. So that's really what the first question is going to be. We'll dig right into it. So really, I think I would love to understand, how does your work, the work that y'all are doing, intersect with the housing challenges for middle-income households? And how can initiatives such as the Home Initiative that we were talking about, how can these create more opportunities for people to age in place or be first-time home buyers? And any one of y'all can kick us off. Go ahead.
There we go. Good evening. So wonderful to be here, Vez, and it's wonderful to be here with you all. I really appreciate the breadth and depth of work that you've been doing in Texas and Austin. So I have been really excited and privileged to be a part of the Biden-Harris administration, very specifically to work with Secretary Fudge. So the work that we are doing at HUD is just to, one, to increase the equity and access to safe, decent, affordable housing. But also, we just really need more housing. That's the issue that we have in Austin, Texas. That was the issue I saw in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where I was yesterday. It's the issue we're facing in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We need housing. And we need to put it in places where we have strong, established infrastructure in place. We need to be building where the people are. And quite frankly, as I look at the home program and the idea of accessory dwelling units, well, I mean, it's exciting for the secretary. It's exciting for the housing market, and personally, as a Latina, I value the ability to have more community and intergenerational households. I think it makes for stronger health outcomes. I think it improves some of our social determinants of health when we are able to have more cohesive communities and intergenerational households as a possibility, but also that ability to have that greater income. And I should talk a little bit more about what we're actually doing. I'm sorry about this. But one of the things that we're doing is we are trying to make it easier for first-time home buyers to just get their foot in the market. And we were just looking at how difficult it can be. So when we're talking about the HUD home program, which is different from yours, we actually make available to localities funds to be available for down payment programs, for assistance in minor repairs, helping folks to age in place. We have, for a long time, had lead mitigation funds available as well. So we are doing everything that we can to keep people in their homes. We're also working really hard to look at what we can do within the administration to make it easier for folks to access loans. One of the things that I really love that we've done as a millennial with student loan debt that I am paying now is making sure that student loan debt doesn't count as much against you when you're trying to take out an FHA loan. So that's one huge thing that we've needed to do for a while. The other huge thing that I think we've needed to do for a while is count your ability to pay for housing as your ability to pay for a loan. So we are now counting positive rental history in your ability to get FHA loans. So we are looking at all of these different little ways in which we can shape the market, increase and encourage home building, and just increase that housing supply all the way around.
I really appreciate it. I'll just make one tiny comment and pass it on to Scott. I feel like you, but I just want to say I feel like this is such a great sort of prelude to all of these policies and stuff that HUD is doing, how it can interact here with the, the work that we're doing here in Austin on regulation and how we're able to really build and move towards a community where more folks have housing opportunities. Scott, I feel like you were ready to go, so go.
Sure. Thank you. I agree, really. You've got to be able to afford a home, and that means typically you're taking out a loan. And so we've been building homes in Central Austin since 2001, so 20 plus years. I've been a real estate agent for even longer than I've been a home builder. So I'm familiar with the market and pricing and so on, and also familiar with the challenges, that it takes to really get a house built here in Austin. It's time consuming compared to other cities. And there are a lot of codes that apply that make it more difficult than you would expect, right? And we're very familiar with that. We build a lot of ADUs, and we try and build extra units on lots wherever we can. So currently, the city allows for 2 units on most urban lots, which is where we build urban infill, a house and an ADU. And so we build a house and an ADU. We typically sell them separately. And those 2 units, those 2 homes, sell for 40 to 70% less than a single-family home on that same lot. And I think that's a very important takeaway here. Is there is a significant difference in the price of a home when you're not paying for so much land just for one house, and all that complexity that I was talking about really incentivizes single-family homes here in Austin, and we see that in what are called one-for-one demos. If you demolish a very small house and just replace it with a bigger house that's 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 times more expensive, which happens today, right? That doesn't do anything for our affordability, our housing crisis, or any of the other reasons why we're up here today. So the data around that in terms of permits clearly backs that up. So over the past 8 years, which have been, since 2015, you could build an ADU on every lot. So over the past 8 years, only 12% of the building permits in the city of Austin were for a second unit. Out of everything else was single-family homes, despite record demand, right? You would think people would be clamoring to build 2 units on every lot all the time because they're more affordable, and more affordable units, more people can qualify for, right? That actually got me through the Great Recession. I was building duplexes in Zilker, and the mortgage market collapsed, and those duplexes people could still afford. They sold for around $400,000, and they could still get loans, and there were a whole lot more buyers who could afford a $400,000 house than who could afford $1 million house. And I think that's also an important takeaway here. So in terms of affordability, we really need a change in our current system of how we produce housing. Today it's 1 and 2 units per lot. Under the home initiative, going to 3 means more affordability, right, and more attainability in every neighborhood. Again, this applies citywide, and I think that's an important takeaway. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Hey, good evening, everyone. So I'm the one person on this panel. I think I don't do anything. I just study things since I'm an academic, but I've got a particular interest in. Sure. Is that better? So as an academic researcher, I particularly like to study cases where cities have tried to loosen up the land use rules to, do exactly what Scott was just talking about, building more than 1 unit on a small lot, maybe cases where you could build something more than just an accessory dwelling unit, plus a house. And, but the thing that's tricky about it is there are just so few cases in the US. It's hard to study something that hasn't happened a whole lot. So that's why I want to actually talk about Houston. Now, I know a lot of people here in Austin love to hate Houston, and not just those who are Texas Rangers fans. I don't know about your preferences, Director, but the thing is that unless I'm missing something, Houston's the only U.S. city that made a big reform that allowed this to happen. And that did it long enough ago that we can really see what happened. And I just want to start, there is this misconception that Houston, everyone knows it's the only big city in the US that doesn't have zoning. The misconception is that it just doesn't have any rules and you can do anything you want, and that is absolutely not true there. Houston regulates just about everything that's regulated in other cities. They just don't call it zoning. But the story there is in 1998, Houston's mayor and council chose to dramatically reduce their minimum lot size. So they did something analogous to what Councilmember Poole is proposing in the second phase of her home initiative. And in this case, the minimum lot size had been 5,000 square feet, and then it was reduced all the way down to 1,400 square feet under certain conditions. And at first it was just in the urban core, but then it was later spread to the entire city. So what happened, all these years later? You could view it as just a little bit happened, or you could view it as a lot happened, depending on how you think about it. On the one hand, according to a study I did recently with a couple of our other PhD students, Abia Nomandakai and Josh Conrad, only 0.5% of the lots in Houston that were single-family lots in 2007 had been redeveloped with townhouses by 2020. So that doesn't sound like that much. And by townhouses, what I mean is tall, skinny houses on small lots that sometimes touch each other and sometimes are technically detached, although close together. On the other hand, this resulted in over 5,000 new townhouses built on these former single-family parcels, although these 5,000 were a small minority out of the 25 to 30,000 townhouses built total, depending on how you count. So most of the townhouses were built on former commercial parcels or industrial parcels or big chunks of vacant land, and then only about 5,000 of them were built on former single-family lots. So what about the spatial patterns, right? Like a lot of people think, the first thing that they think is that this exacerbates gentrification. In the case of Houston, that's not really what happened. It's true that the vast majority of the single-family to townhouse redevelopments happened inside Houston's inner loop, but all else equal, a parcel was much more likely to be redeveloped if it was in a neighborhood where the median income was much above average back in the year 2000. And then what about affordability? As we heard earlier from the previous panel, really our focus tonight is middle income housing. Clearly this reform doesn't produce very low income housing, at least not anytime soon. But if you take all the townhouses in Houston that took advantage of the new rules and that were built on former single family parcels, and then if you compare them to all the single family houses that were built during that same time period but on lots of 5,000 square feet or bigger, then the median townhouse has an assessed value in 2020 of $225,000 less than the median single-family house. And it's not like these are tiny houses. These are generally fairly large family-sized houses. The median square footage is 2,100. So I think you can say pretty convincingly that at least in Houston, these townhouses represented a real savings for someone looking for entry-level home ownership in the urban core. So just to wrap up, to me the Houston story suggests that it's at least possible that reducing minimum lot sizes in Austin could do a lot of good. And then just to close, I have to give a lot of credit to Councilmember Poole. She's a very rare example of a local elected official who's changed her mind on a lot of these issues. I've only heard of one other example in the entire United States, and I really follow this stuff. So I really applaud her for being willing to try something new in response to what we heard from Dr. Losi earlier, this new reality we're in. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jake. And before we move on to sort of Mike, I feel like both what you and Scott are mentioning, even the dollar figures, if you look back at what Dr. Losi was mentioning, right, like even the 50,000 that we're talking about opens up opportunities for so many more people. So if you remember those numbers, roughly the chart, I'm thinking about it back in my head, those are thousands and thousands of households and families who suddenly have opportunities to purchase a home who otherwise would never have that opportunity. So it's very exciting to hear that. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No, thank you, thank you, and fully agreed on all of your points in the discussion so far. So I've been asked to provide a national perspective. By way of background, my name is Mike Kingsella. I run an organization called Up for Growth. We're a national policy organization that is laser focused on solving America's severe shortage of homes. And the shortage of homes is severe nationwide. It's particularly acute here in Austin, Texas, has been a long time. So also second, thanks to Councilmember Poole for your leadership on this local solution. So I've been asked to talk about the national landscape and where Austin fits into that. And then I think later on in the conversation, we're going to get into the weeds on some policies, and my perspective is going to be from a federal perspective and how that fits into the local landscape here in Austin. But big picture, from 2012 to 2021, America's shortage of homes has far more than doubled, moving from about 1.6 million missing homes back in 2012 to 3.9 million missing homes as of today. If we narrow in on the period following the onset of the pandemic, we saw that the number of communities in America, the number of counties experiencing a housing deficit, increased by 31 percentage points. So we've really seen the spreading of the housing deficit. And to the director's point, right, the need for more homes in all corners of the country has never been as clear as it is today. And here in Austin, the rate of increase in the housing deficit actually continues to outpace the nation as a whole. Nationwide, from 2019 to 2021, America's deficit grew by about 3 percentage points. Here in Austin, the regional deficit across the metro area increased by 4.3%. So about a 25% outpace in terms of the rate of the problem getting worse nationwide. So, what does that mean in practice? And I think we heard this from the Board of Realtors presentation a bit ago, is that as America has underproduced relative to housing needs, it has not underproduced evenly. The shortage of homes is particularly acute at the lower end of the income distribution, those extremely low income and those very low income households. We also know that we don't have the starter homes that we used to have in the 1970s and 1980s and early 1990s. So it's as though we've plucked through a breakdown, a failure. You could call it a market failure. You could call it a failure of local policies that aren't meeting community needs today. We've removed rungs of the ladder of opportunity. And so, for a would-be first-time home buyer to get into home ownership, we saw how difficult it is to get into home. I think the statistic was triple that of the affordability in 2011. And so what this is really about to us is how do we leverage land use and zoning policy to create to replace those rungs in the ladder and create the opportunity for folks to live in the neighborhood where they can take advantage of community assets and resources and ultimately build wealth through home ownership and ensure housing stability for all residents of the community. And that's really what policies like this are all about and why they're so important as a remedy to the nation's systemic underproduction of housing.
Appreciate that, Mike. And Administrator, we're going to go back to you. And you were talking about the amazing work that the Biden administration is doing and sort of expanding opportunities nationwide. And some of it is y'all are picking the baton from the Obama administration and the work that they were trying to do. But at the same time, there's so many new and amazing things that HUD is considering, including the partnership with the FHA. Why is it necessary for this administration and HUD at this time to really advance such policies nationwide and focus on issues of land use?
So he just said it, right? We have a deficit of, 3.9 million, and I keep hearing numbers all over the map, but then none of them are small, right? We have a housing shortage. We have a record number of young people who are not able to find their way to their first home. I mean, my mom initially was able to purchase her first home at 26 as enlisted in the Army. I could not imagine that happening right now. Someone in their mid to early 20s trying to buy. I mean, she was in Killeen, right? So trying to buy outside of a major metro area right now. So we are in. coming out of COVID, I think we've really exacerbated problems that existed in the first place. I think we had a housing problem before then, but now it's very much prominent and it's very much dire. And as I said, housing is a social determinant of health. If we can't keep people in stable, affordable neighborhoods, if we can't foster that sense of community, a lot of lives are actually at risk. I, as a young child, experienced housing insecurity myself, and I, bounced around from place to place. Unfortunately, my mother lost that house due to some extenuating circumstances. And when you look at the ways in which children see their success going years hence, it starts to go further and further away as they go from place to place to place to place. And as you are looking at a lot of families right now who are considering rents going up and up and up, as they're considering how to support other relatives that are aging, they're not able to keep themselves in that sort of stability that makes for a good and stable country. So I'm sorry, I'm so long-winded. Long story short, the situation is dire, and we're trying to move as fast as we can, and it always feels it's just so slow to us even. But we are working tirelessly to make sure that Americans get the homes that they need.
Appreciate, definitely your work, HUD's work, the administration's work, and the work that we're trying to do. And definitely, I feel like, the work that folks are doing locally. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I also want to just sort of jump in there. The Biden administration has been doing a lot of great work around the Housing Supply Action Plan that it unveiled, about a couple years ago. We have had the fortune through Up for Growth Action, our federal advocacy affiliate, to plug into bipartisan efforts in Congress, working in concert with the administration, I think really poised to move the needle, as one of our speakers said earlier, on addressing the deficit at a national scale. And I just want to call out a couple of new programs or new policy efforts that tie directly into the Home Act here in Austin. One, and I hope I'm not stepping on something you were planning on talking about. We worked with a group of bipartisan sponsors in Congress, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, then Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, on a bill called the Housing Supply and Affordability Act, which proposed to create a brand new program at HUD that would provide resources to local communities like Austin to engage communities in conversations like this and to design and implement pro-housing policies that are going to get at artificial barriers to housing, whatever they may be, right? A very flexible program, but to support community engagement, policy design, and implementation. Flash forward to last December, Congress incorporated a provision in the FY22 spending bill to appropriate several $1 million to what is now called the Pro-Housing Grant Program that HUD has provided. And I think the deadline is November 6th now?
Yes.
For cities. And in my travels, we're hearing lots of cities, lots of regions, lots of states even applying for these proceeds, and it's to support the work that's happening here in Austin. It's programs like what's happening here in Austin. So I think that's a good example of where the federal government is partnering with local leaders to really drive solutions. The second piece is a bill, and I think this is something that is particularly relevant to Cap Metro's role in this conversation, is this conversation around housing around transit. A similar bipartisan coalition of legislators in Congress today introduced a bill called the Build More Housing Near Transit Act. And what it does is it incentivizes transit agencies to collaborate with local jurisdictions to align zoning policies to allow things like missing middle housing solutions in order to get preference or bonus points in accessing transit funding. So this is something that's coming. The Biden administration has talked about it. Members of Congress, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, are talking about it. And today a bill was introduced. In the bill text, it mentions that transit agencies working with local governments that allow lot splits that reduce minimum lot sizes are going to get a bonus point in the application for federal transit funding. So again, I think what's happening here in Austin, in a way, is a microcosm of a movement that is growing across the country, a desperately needed movement to break down these barriers to housing equity and adequate housing in our communities. And I'm just really encouraged to be here in this conversation today, and really appreciate the work the administration and our federal leadership is doing as well.
Thank you, and I think that highlights the point that you know, so many times when we were building affordable housing in the past, aside from the horrors of segregation, as we were building far away from infrastructure, far away from opportunity, and the administration, and I know this did begin with the Obama administration, is very conscious of the fact that transportation is critical, both to economic opportunity and greater equity in that opportunity for everyone. So we're, again, really excited to be advancing the ball here as much as we can under these circumstances.
And for folks who, you know, I'm going to assume our local folks know, we're working on Project Connect right now, which is billions of dollars in transit infrastructure that our local taxpayers have committed to having a light rail project in Bus Rapid in Austin. And we will be going for federal match funding in the coming years. And so, Mike, right, like what you're describing in terms of initiatives such as this, boosting our ability to access those funds, yes, please, someone listen up there and help support us in those work, because it's something that we all as a community are really pushing for having that link between housing and transit. Scott, I'll move to you and, you know, really talk about what role does infill housing play in expanding opportunities for a broader range of Austinites, really, and particularly for these middle-income home buyers that we're talking about.
So as we've been talking about, you know, being able to get more units on a given lot, there's less land per unit, and that is sort of inherently more affordable, you know. And then that same thing applies in every neighborhood. Not every neighborhood is affordable today, nor has it been. There are expensive neighborhoods and less expensive neighborhoods. But having the ability to make the housing in each neighborhood a little more approachable and a little less expensive than a single-family home on a single-family lot is going to significantly increase the opportunities that Austinites have to buy a home. And those opportunities today, as we saw earlier with some of that data, are gone. If you're a median income earner in Austin, you cannot buy a median home here, and you never will be able to. And that, as someone who, you know, builds houses and sells houses and believes very strongly in the advantages of being able to buy a home and everything that comes with it, you know, that's the American dream in many, many ways, and that has been taken away from the average Austinite. And I think that's an important thing to understand about why changes in regulatory barriers, removing them, that like the Home Act does, or excuse me, the Home Initiative does, is critical, right? You've heard a lot of talk about barriers and to housing. To give you an idea of how big the barrier is to build 3 units on one lot, I talked about I build 2, a house and an ADU. For starters, it takes 2 years to go through the zoning and approval process to go from 2 units to 3. So if I want to add 1 more unit on a lot, it's a 2-year approval process. It costs a minimum of $100,000 plus in fees, minimum. And contrast that, and then I have to build it, right? So that's another year, let's say. So at 3 years to get 3 units, right? Contrast that with a single family home. Today, I can walk in, get a building permit in a few months, build it in a year or so, if that. You know, I could build 3 single-family homes on 3 different lots. In the same amount of time, I can get approval and build 3 homes on 1 lot today. And that simply has to change if we really are going to meet the needs of our entire populace to be able to afford a home, period. So I'm really excited to see this happen. It's been a long time coming.
Thank you, Scott. You know, those are all sort of really important points, and how do we really sort of, you know, focus on our local community and its needs. You know, folks like Selena and Rob, and they're reminding us what folks here are struggling with. So I appreciate that very much. Jake, I'll ask you a question, right? So how do the Home Initiative is a program that proposes, you know, both more homes per lot, as we're talking about today, and then also looking at reducing lot sizes in sort of future phases. What can we learn from Portland's experiment with creating opportunities for small homes and small lots in terms of both the impact on affordability and housing dispersion and having them all over the city?
Yeah, so Portland's a really interesting case, and I know that Mike comes from there originally, so you know, you probably have been following it really closely, so you should jump in if I miss something. But and just to be clear, I haven't studied it personally, but I've enthusiastically, you know, read things that other people have been writing about it. But, and also just to set the table, Austin's, according to Zillow at least, Portland's median house price is basically the same as Austin. So I think it's a fairly good comparison in terms of the resulting house prices. But so they passed something called the Residential Infill Program in about a little over 2 years ago. And I, looked at a one-year report that the city commissioned. And from what I can tell, it's working. It's producing 2, 3, 4, and 6 unit developments really dispersed throughout most of the city. And according to this report, over 99% of the middle housing units have 2 or more bedrooms, so it's filling a niche that ADUs, however great they are, don't fill for people who need bigger bedrooms. And then another interesting thing is 44% of the single-family houses that were built in the 4 years leading up to the passage of this reform were bigger than the reform would have allowed. So that's sort of a weird way to say it, but that's evidence that it's really curtailing mansionization, and it's incentivizing building the same amount of stuff but split into multiple units rather than just as one giant house like Scott was talking about. And just to give one specific example, the report provides this example of a 12-unit townhouse project where on multiple lots, but where the average unit is 1,000 square feet, 2-bedroom, and sells for $420,000. And this is a neighborhood, it's a really nice part of Portland. It's the same distance from City Hall as Hyde Park is from downtown Austin. So I think if they can do it over there, I think we might have a shot at doing it here too.
I really appreciate that, Jake, and that seems like a challenge in the end right there. If they can do it, we can do it too. Before we move on to sort of just some wrap-up questions, I want to remind folks, so for today, for the audience Q&A, we're using a little tool called Slido. So if you have any questions, just scan that QR code and we'll keep it up there. And you'll be able to go into your portal and I'll be able to see all of your questions popping up, and we'll try to get through them as fast as possible and as many as possible. So again, you'll be able to just use your camera or something, point at the QR code and pick it up from there. Michael, I'll sort of go to one sort of last question for you and then go to a general question for everybody. But you talked a lot about sort of why housing has become so out of reach for Americans everywhere. Why is it really critical to address this issue nationwide, not just from this perspective of affordability, but to advance these other social, economic, and environmental goals?
Yeah, thank you. And I think that the one-pager that's available at the desk speaks to the social, environmental, and economic effects of not having enough housing in Austin and the benefits of this policy. I want to maybe just step back a minute and first say that this type of challenge, missing millions of homes, our nation has experienced this before. And we solved it before, and we can solve it again through these types of actions. The second component is I want to speak to equity, and I know you had mentioned the equity lens is a priority of the administration thinking about this issue. Clearly, we need more homes, right? Just period, full stop. But if you think about, and I think the speakers in this conversation have alluded to the exclusionary history of a lot of barriers to housing, particularly in high opportunity neighborhoods across the city of Austin, across the country, frankly. Tearing down those barriers is an important step, but it's not enough. Where I think there is a huge opportunity to advance housing equity, building on this work, is by thinking about what are the opportunities that middle housing legalization creates. So I'll give an example, actually in Portland, Oregon, where in a in a close-in neighborhood, old streetcar suburb of Portland, there was a property with a derelict home that, without the residential infill project having been enacted, would have gone to a tear-down developer who would have built something on the order of 3 McMansions on that property. and made a tidy profit, right? But instead, because the city had implemented the residential infill project, allowing duplexes and triplexes on these single detached lots, Habitat for Humanity of Portland, Oregon was able to come in and ultimately deliver 15 affordable ownership opportunities for residents in that community, right? To get ahead of displacement pressures, to provide homes for folks who have been part of that community for years, homes that wouldn't have been created otherwise. And so I think as we think about middle housing policies and zoning reform writ large, let's not forget to take that extra step around designing intentional policies to get at how do we more evenly distribute homeownership opportunities? How do we ensure that all of our citizens have a fair shake and ability to access housing stability in good, in quality, and attainable and affordable housing? So that's hopefully responsive, I think, to what you're getting at. And so I can if there's a more specific question in there,
No,
happy
that
to
sounds
address
great,
that.
and we're already have audience questions coming in. But
Okay,
to close
great.
off, I'd love to hear from sort of the other three folks. I guess just sort of closing thoughts on how do we advance these other community goals around equity and mobility and preservation, environment. And I think some of that, Mike, you've really teed us perfectly, but we can use initiatives such as HOME to really advance those other community goals. I don't know if you all have any thoughts on that.
You know, certainly there are clear benefits to living closer to where you work, right? And so the ability to not have to drive for 20 miles to go to work, maybe that's 2 miles, right? Frees up a lot of time, but it also frees up a lot of resources for transit, both for individuals, but also for cities, right? You know, we're paying for roads and so on. And on top of that, you know, from the data that I've seen from Environment Texas and some other groups, I think sprawl is one of the worst things that we can do as a city in terms of climate change, right? That you're essentially housing policies or restrictive housing policies are forcing people to drive until they qualify, right? That old adage. And right now, that drive is pretty far. You know, if you're going to median income earner in Austin, I think the median income earner in Austin can afford a $311,000 home, according to the city's, you know, sort of mortgage calculations. The median home in Bastrop, which is one of our more affordable, you know, cities in the region here, the median home there is $350,000. So you know, the median earner in Austin can't really even afford a home, you know, outside of Austin, and then they've got to drive to and from if they want to buy, right? So I do think there's a lot of sort of convergence around housing and these other, you know, goals, because if you've got to drive that far to buy a home, which again, the American dream of home ownership, that takes you away from all your relationships and family and so on that might be in the area you used to live in, right? So you're faced with a hard choice of, if I want to own a home, I have to move to Bastrop, right? And maybe that comes with trade-offs too. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
So one of the things that I like to drive home, particularly in cities where we're having this discussion, and thank you so much for talking about the fact that there are folks that are having to drive in many, many miles. When we're thinking about climate, when we're thinking about air quality, we want to think about folks having to commute long distances. But I also want to say that affordable housing is also affordable labor. We're always talking about how folks, or we are not, I don't think we here are talking about it, but I hear, oh, well, people just don't want to work anymore. They just don't want to work for a living. And my answer to that is that nobody wants to drive an hour to make you a latte. Nobody. And even if that was their truest delight, they would love to drive over here from Waco to make you a soy mocha. It's just not tenable. It is absolutely not affordable for what people, what people are getting to do these jobs. If you want high quality individuals, like Miss Shea, Miss Lena, I don't know if she is still here, if you want to have, as your first responders who are invested in the communities in which you are living, if you want that wonderful character, if you like that art studio, if you like going to yoga classes, if you like the performing arts, you are talking about lots of people who do work of passion on the margins. Okay, they have willingly worked for peanuts in order to deliver this, and now I'm seeing cities with rich characters that are developed by some of these different things that are available, just losing all of their character. It's like the blood has drained from their faces, and all we can really see is the same restaurant, the same coffee shop. I won't name names. The same, the same, big box grocery store, and nobody knows anyone anymore because again, you have people driving from many, many miles away in here. You don't have the kid from down, the high school down the street that you saw grow up working in the grocery store. You're seeing adults that are struggling and possibly working multiple jobs in order to find their way to a good living situation. And so, my secretary, Secretary Fudge, she was a mayor in Ohio, and she brings to the table a community-first perspective. And when we're thinking about affordable housing, we shouldn't be thinking about, people moving from over there. I feel like a lot of Austinites think that people moving from over there are going to be the takers of affordable housing, but it's actually people from right here who would like to remain here, who would like to continue to invest in those communities. And the Biden-Harris administration and Secretary Fudge, and me personally, are trying to make it so that communities can stay cohesive and whole, because it just makes absolutely everything about it, from our entertainment to our access to food, to our environmental quality, to just our access to our loved ones, so much better. And it really enhances our economic success. So I want to thank you all, and Councilwoman Poole, for doing the work that you are doing in order to make this happen.
I appreciate that. We'll go into sort of questions. You're a smart and clever audience, and you're going to keep me on my toes because there's a lot of good questions here. And I can already see folks have realized that you can upvote other people's questions, so I'll go ahead and select those as possible. We'll try to get through a lot of these, but still get you all out of here on time. So the first question is, really focused on, I guess, Jacob, hopefully you can help us sort of figure this out. But, as these other cities are doing these kind of initiatives, do we see a rise in home ownership? I don't know if you or others have thoughts on that. Is there sort of a greater path to home ownership as well?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure. I think, like I said earlier, I think Houston is again, unless I'm missing something, but Houston's the only city that made this sort of reform long enough ago that has really made a big impact on the landscape of the city. I don't think Houston's homeownership rate has changed a ton since 20 years ago. I could be wrong. But, I mean, Houston, one thing that you can say is that as the urban core of Houston has grown enormously in the last 20 years, unlike the vast majority of other U.S. cities, there's relatively affordable homeownership options right in the urban core. So, so I don't know if homeownership will skyrocket in Austin if we're successful with this, but maybe we can keep what we have, and especially in those urban core neighborhoods.
And I'll just be brief, but we track in our underproduction report, we track the black versus white homeownership gap. And we know that the black versus white homeownership gap today is at the widest point since 1968, the year that Lyndon B. Johnson signed the
Wider.
Sorry?
It's wider.
Wider, yes, wider, absolutely, right. And there is a correlation of that gap and the extent to which there is a housing shortage at the metro level. And so I suspect, and I'll need to check these numbers, but I would suspect that places like Houston that have ensured that middle income, affordable homeownership opportunities exist for their residents are experiencing a lower gap in terms of home ownership by race and class than other jurisdictions that have much larger shortages and where the average home price is much higher.
Yeah, I think that gap here in Austin is quite wide. Certainly, I remember seeing a study from 2015, and it was a rare stat that wasn't a positive about Austin, but we're the most socioeconomically segregated city in the country, by like a wide margin, And in terms of urban population, we have like 30% of our jobs are within 3 miles of downtown. It's the highest concentration of urban jobs in the country. But our population density in that same area is a suburban level of population density, and that is entirely due to regulation. We have single-family homes, right around the corner from downtown, and have for a very long time. So I do think that these kind of changes, we can see Houston was able to get ahead of that, but we have to start somewhere, and this is an important step.
And I'll go a little cliched here and talk about, right, as an affordable housing advocate, we often talk about the toolkit, right? So there's a vast array of things that we have to be tackling to tackle affordability. And this is, of course, one integral part of that. But the other thing, and we saw that with Dr. Losi's presentation and the work that the FHA and HUD are trying to do, is expanding people's ability to be able to access the finance, right? And with shrinking sort of, wages over the years, or at least not keeping pace with the growth in housing cost, that remains a challenge as well. So some of it has to be how much housing are we providing and how many opportunities we're creating, but also the great work that's happening federally to open up those opportunities from a financial perspective.
I actually just read that HUD has changed their qualification criteria for ADUs. If you want to get a loan to buy an ADU, you can't count the income towards your income when you qualify. It makes financing an ADU extremely much harder than you would think, because essentially you're building a second home in your backyard, and you have to be able to afford both in order to get that loan to build the ADU. And HUD, I think, has changed that.
Thank you so much for adding. Yes, so that's one of the ways in which we are trying to expand that affordability piece. And I actually wanted to also kind of piggyback a little bit on the discussion of access to equitable access to equity. One of the things that we're also working on in terms of Black and brown wealth acquisition, because of that great wealth gap, is property appraisal equity. And it's actually a problem all over the country. It's even a problem in Houston. So on average, even when you're accounting for amenities, even if you're accounting for income of folks, Black neighborhoods are getting homes appraised at $48,000 lower than white neighborhoods of, again, comparable status. That actually turns out to become $169 billion in wealth gap for Black and brown families, which that money, it's not taken from it's taken from the Black community, but it basically goes nowhere. And so the ability to buy or to stay in neighborhoods, and the ability to possibly, if you want to, take out, and I know this has an interesting reputation, but a reverse mortgage or a home equity conversion mortgage, so that you can continue to pay for your expenses and possibly age in place, are highly affected by the ability to have a good appraisal. I don't know if you had followed some of the news on this, but the Austin family, but they're not of Austin, they're of Northern California. They had their home appraised because they were going to be doing a remodel. African-American family. They thought that their appraisal was a little light, so they did this thing called whitewashing. They took everything down in their house that indicated that they were there, their pictures, their magazines, their art. They had a friend come over, and white friend, white neighbor, put up their pictures, their art, and the difference in appraisal was $500,000. Yes. This family has testified before Congress a couple of times to talk about this, because the property appraisal industry is the most segregated business in the country. It's actually only 4% person of color, and it is only 20% female, which is not at all a reflection of this country. And so that's kind of the invisible fight, I think, is just looking at that access through folks that have somehow managed to maintain their homes or to acquire homes is that their homes should be considered on level playing field with other families when they're being appraised. And right now the Secretary is working with 13 other federal agencies on PAVE, so it's the Property Appraisal Valuation Equity Task Force, to get this industry on a better track in terms of just reflecting the country that it's working with, making sure that we're not starting to move over to AI and rely on old algorithms that were segregated in the first place, and really making sure that those comparables are true comparables and not just something somebody's cherry picking because they happen to look at the family and not like the look of them. So we're doing a lot of real work so that that equity increases and that the home ownership opportunities increase with them.
I appreciate that. There's sort of two questions. I'm going to lump them together. So one is really, as we're focusing on, middle to lower income households and providing housing opportunities, how do we respond to the issue of investors coming in and outbidding these prospective buyers? And there's a similar question, I'll read it out at the same time, which is there a connection between the shortage in affordable homes and the increase in landlords and investors buying and renting out single family homes?
I've never built a home for someone to rent out. To give you an idea of how hard that is, right? Like of all the homes I've built over 20 years, none of them were built by someone who wanted to be a landlord because the costs are just too high. You can't make the numbers work. I don't know the stats in Houston or really around the country in that sense, but I think that sort of fear of like, hey, someone's going to come in and rent a whole neighborhood out. Well, yes, build to rent is a category that of new housing. You just don't see that in existing neighborhoods, again, because of costs, really, prices.
Mike, did you want to say something? I saw you.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that by saying I believe the growth of the build-to-rent business is a reflection of the fact that there are not enough starter homes, right? So we have a generation that is predominantly a renter generation, right? More, the millennial generation, of which I'm also part of, we're the first generation that was not able to buy a home at the age that on average our parents did. And so the first generation in American history. And so I think that the environment of scarcity that we are in around housing has given rise to a number of, challenging dynamics that we're grappling with today.
Appreciate that. Scott, there's a question that's specifically for you, but I'm sure other folks can jump in as well. Do we have enough tradesmen and tradeswomen to build more housing if city land use does change?
If you'd asked me that question 2 years ago, I would say no. I think the city was so underwater in terms of its ability to build. We were probably building at 120% of our actual capacity to produce anything, right? We were building offices, apartments, housing as fast as we could, like many, many cities around the country. But as our market has cooled, we saw the stats earlier, so has that demand for construction. So one of the biggest obstacles that we had during that time is simply cost of living, right? Normally, if you hear there's a lot of work in Austin and you're a plumber, you can come to Austin and get some work. But if your cost of living here is twice what it is in Houston, Dallas, or San Antonio, somebody talked about this earlier. Your actual sort of like net, perhaps it was Selena. Your net pay is actually less by moving to an area where there is actually more work. And that's because of regulatory barriers to housing, but point blank, whether it's rental or for sale. So no, I think we can meet the demand, and really this is not the same thing as sort of large scale housing production, right? This resolution is going to provide housing opportunities in every neighborhood, right? But much like the ADU permits, right? Only for the past 8 years, only 12% of our permits that are residential, 1 or 2 family, were actually for 2 units, despite all this demand. So I don't think it's going to cause some kind of a run on construction and a run up in prices. They're already pretty high, but nonetheless, I don't think it's going to have that effect.
I was going to say, and I think, I'll mention one thing from our perspective. As I mentioned, I worked on the affordable housing bond campaigns in Austin, and our 2013 one had been 86 million, I can remember off the top of my head. And the next one that we pitched was 250 million. And we asked ourselves, we're like, are there enough people who can build for $250 million? Do we have enough affordable housing builders and providers who can do this work? What has been really exciting is we saw that once that opportunity opened up, there was a massive upskilling in our community. We had folks who had been working in the Valley who came in and were providing us with affordable housing construction for seniors and things like that. So essentially, when those opportunities are created, there's also an expansion within your sort of your local market to absorb the changes. So, you know, knock on wood, that's going to be our experience with a lot of this work as well. I'll sort of come to my maybe last question. We might have maybe time for one more. I'll try to go over this one first, which is how can we best communicate to established existing homeowners that have housing challenges that younger future generations, the have-nots, will face in the coming future? So how do we communicate that with existing homeowners, sort of the challenges they're being faced by future generations?
Well, I think maybe one of the strongest arguments that breaks through, and we heard Councilmember Poole articulate it earlier, was thinking about their own children if they have them. You know, you can be very secure and well off and comfortable yourself, but things get quite real when you realize that your adult child can't live in the same neighborhood where they grew up. And then I guess the other thing I would spotlight is someone who, well, and as we heard from Rob Schneider earlier about concerning the AARP, is, you know, you might be secure in your home today, but, you know, 5-10 years from now, something could happen with your physical health that could put you in a whole new situation. It'd be a lot better if you had some more options.
I think I'm going to say this, you know, as an adult child with a parent, I think that my mom would rate me middling at best, but her grandkids are phenomenal to her. And well, they're phenomenal to me. I mean, I love them. And I think talking about the idea of, wouldn't you like to see those grandkids grow up, or your granddogs? Some people really spoil their granddogs. Grow up in the neighborhood where you raised them. Wouldn't you like to see your grandchildren grow up right near you? I think that when we're talking, you know, so many places are talking about, sorry, not places, folks are talking about their kids living farther and farther away. There are a lot of folks I know in Austin, I've heard a lot of that in California, where they can't afford to live back home in the neighborhood where they grew up. So driving home family, driving home culture, driving home the idea that if you want people to, again, make your coffee, if you want people to clean your house, if you want folks to make your life easier, they need to be able to afford to live near you.
I think that's probably one of the reasons why the AARP is such a big proponent of ADUs, right? If your child can't afford to live anywhere near where they grew up and they want to, well, you're going to need to build an ADU for them in your backyard, you know, which to me is sort of a win-win. You know, either your kids are building one for you or you're building one for your kids, either way. So I think that's great.
Appreciate that. So I guess we'll sort of wrap up here, but we have a comment from the audience. I'll just read it out. It's more of a comment. This is anonymous. Someone saying, I just paid $2,900 to fix my 7-year-old vehicle. My wife has a $6,000 quote to fix her 7-year-old vehicle. I don't have a question. I was just listening to your panel speak and having warm thoughts of light rail along a row house boulevard. Don't know which one of y'all it was, but yes, really, thank you for that comment, right? But that's really, in some ways, you know, the future that we're envisioning. I'll wrap up here in a second, but I do want to just thank y'all so much. Hopefully, y'all can join me in a big hand of applause for these folks.